A pale morning haze lifts over the Ethiopian highlands, revealing ridgelines that seem to fold endlessly into one another, dark rock and red earth catching the first light of day. Smoke rises from thousands of cooking fires. Metal glints where the sun finds it. Rifle barrels, spearheads, shields worn smooth by generations of hands. The ground hums with motion, not chaos, but purpose. Men arrive on foot, on horseback, with pack animals straining under grain, ammunition, and water skins. This is not the image Europe expects to see in Africa at the end of the 19th century. It does not look improvised. It does not look fragile. It looks prepared. Far beyond these mountains, in the polished halls of European capitals, Africa is being divided with rulers and ink. The maps are clean. The lines are confident. Almost the entire continent has been reduced to colors representing distant flags. The belief behind those lines is simple and rarely questioned, that African societies will fall quickly, inevitably, once confronted by modern armies and imperial will. Ethiopia, marked but not yet absorbed, is considered an exception only temporarily, a gap that will soon be closed. If you stay with this story to the end, you'll see how that certainty unraveled, not through myth or miracle, but through calculation, diplomacy, and an empire that understood the world it was facing better than Europe understood it. What happens next will force an entire continent and an entire ideology to confront its own illusions. Long before soldiers gather in these highlands, Ethiopia already occupies a singular place in the African world. It is not a newly formed state scrambling to respond to European pressure. It is an old empire with a centralized monarchy, a court culture fluent in diplomacy, and a political memory shaped by centuries of survival. Ethiopian rulers have negotiated with Muslims and Christians, traded with the Red Sea world, and defended their highland core against external domination again and again. This history matters because it shapes how Ethiopia responds when Europe arrives not as a trading partner, but as a conqueror. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa accelerates with ruthless speed. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium carve out vast colonial domains. Italy, newly unified and eager to prove itself a great power, enters this competition late and insecure. It seeks prestige as much as territory. Colonial success, Italian leaders believe, will announce their arrival on the world stage. The Horn of Africa, close to Italy across the Mediterranean and Red Sea routes, appears to offer that opportunity. Italy establishes footholds along the Red Sea coast, forming what will become Eritrea. From there, the logic of empire points inland. Ethiopia, mountainous and independent, stands in the way. European racial ideology supplies reassurance, modern weapons, professional armies, and civilizational superiority are assumed to guarantee victory. Ethiopian resistance is imagined as brave but doomed, an obstacle to be cleared rather than a force to be reckoned with. What European observers consistently underestimate is the Ethiopian state itself. Under Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopia is not static. It is modernizing selectively and deliberately. Menelik acquires firearms through international trade, playing European powers against one another to avoid dependency on any single supplier. He expands administrative control over regional rulers, forging a multi-ethnic empire bound not only by loyalty, but by material incentives and shared interest in survival. This is not blind resistance to change. It is adaptation with intent. Menelik understands Europe because Europe has made itself impossible to ignore. Diplomatic missions come and go. Treaties are drafted, debated, translated. Ethiopian elites discuss international law, borders, and recognition in terms that mirror European discourse. Ethiopia is not rejecting the global order. It is insisting on entering it as a sovereign equal. From the European perspective, this insistence is inconvenient. Ethiopia's independence disrupts the visual and ideological completeness of empire. Maps look unfinished. Assumptions feel challenged. Italy, in particular, comes to see Ethiopian sovereignty not merely as an obstacle, but as an affront. Proof that Italy's imperial ambitions are being taken less seriously than those of its rivals. The imbalance of confidence grows quietly. In Rome, officials debate how far Ethiopia can really go. In Addis Ababa, Menelik watches European movements with care, aware that recognition today can become coercion tomorrow. Both sides believe they are acting rationally. Both sides believe time favors them. What makes this moment dangerous is not open hostility, but misreading. Europe mistakes patience for weakness. Ethiopia mistakes diplomacy for stability. Between those assumptions, pressure builds, not with dramatic declarations, but with paperwork, translations, and promises whose meanings are not shared. By the time soldiers begin moving through these highlands, the conflict is already underway, even if no shots have been fired. The battlefield has been prepared in chancelleries and courtrooms, in treaties whose words carry different futures depending on who reads them. The mountains wait, silent witnesses to an argument the world is about to hear far more clearly than anyone intended. Ink dries slowly on parchment in Addis Ababa, but in Rome it hardens into certainty. The Treaty of Wuchal, signed in 1889, is presented as a symbol of cooperation, an agreement between a European power and an African empire recognizing borders, trade, and mutual respect. On the surface, it appears unremarkable, one of dozens of treaties Europe has signed across the continent. Yet buried within its clauses is a fracture line that will split diplomacy open and expose the machinery of empire in full view. In the Italian language version of the treaty, one article carries extraordinary weight. It states that Ethiopia agrees to conduct its foreign affairs through Italy, effectively placing the empire under Italian protection. In the Amharic version presented to Menelik II, the same article reads differently. It does not compel, it permits. Ethiopia may use Italian diplomatic channels if it chooses. The difference is not subtle, it is existential. At Menelik's court, the treaty is understood as a pragmatic compromise. Ethiopia gains recognition of its borders, access to arms, and breathing room in a world rapidly closing in. Menelik is cautious, but not naive. He knows treaties can be tools as sharp as swords. For the moment, however, the agreement seems to stabilize relations. Italian envoys depart satisfied. Ethiopian officials return to the work of governance, mobilization, and consolidation. In Rome, the interpretation hardens quickly. Italian politicians announce to Europe that Ethiopia is now a protectorate. Diplomatic notices are sent to other powers. Maps are adjusted. The claim is made not through invasion, but through language, through the assumption that European interpretation will override African consent. This is empire by footnote, conquest by clause. The response from Menelik's court is measured but firm. Ethiopian officials challenge the claim, pointing to the Amharic text and rejecting any notion of lost sovereignty. Menelik writes to European leaders directly, asserting Ethiopia's independence and clarifying the treaty's meaning. These letters are not emotional appeals. They are legal arguments, framed in the language of international norms Europe claims to uphold. The replies that come back are polite, evasive, and ultimately dismissive. Italy does not retract its claim. Other European powers, unwilling to disrupt the colonial balance, accept Italy's interpretation by default. Silence becomes complicity. The treaty, once a tool of diplomacy, now functions as a trigger. Menelik understands the implication immediately. If Italy's claim stands, Ethiopia's fate is sealed. Protectorate status is not an endpoint. It is a corridor leading inward, narrowing until sovereignty disappears entirely. The only question left is whether that process will unfold gradually or be forced violently into the open. In Addis Ababa, preparations begin quietly. Messengers ride outward in all directions, carrying imperial calls to arms. Regional rulers respond not out of blind loyalty, but shared calculation. They know what Italian expansion has meant elsewhere: land seizures, forced labor, cultural erasure. Unity, however uneasy, offers the only viable defense. Empress Taitu Betul emerges as a decisive voice in this moment. Where Menelik balances diplomacy and caution, Taitu articulates the stakes with clarity. She distrusts Italian intentions completely and presses for readiness rather than reassurance. Her influence is not symbolic. She commands resources, directs logistics, and shapes strategic decisions. In the court's inner circle, there is no illusion left about what lies ahead. Italy, meanwhile, mistakes Ethiopian mobilization for bluff. Reports from colonial officers frame resistance as disorganized, tribal, and unsustainable. The belief in European military superiority remains unshaken. Italian leaders assume that a limited show of force will collapse Ethiopian unity and compel submission. They plan not for a prolonged campaign, but for a decisive demonstration. General Oreste Baratieri, commander of Italian forces in Eritrea, is less certain. From his forward positions, he sees supply lines stretched thin, terrain that favors defenders, and an enemy whose numbers are growing rather than dispersing. His warnings travel upward through the chain of command, but they arrive softened by distance and political expectation. Rome wants results, not caution. Diplomacy gives way to ultimatums. Menelik is told to accept protectorate status or face consequences. The message is framed as inevitability, not threat. Ethiopia's reply is unambiguous. Sovereignty is not negotiable. The treaty, as interpreted by Ethiopia, stands, or it does not stand at all. When negotiations collapse, neither side declares war in the formal European sense. There is no dramatic announcement. Instead, troops move. Forts are reinforced. Supply depots fill and empty. The language of law recedes, replaced by the language of logistics and terrain. What makes this moment irreversible is not pride alone, but precedent. If Italy succeeds in redefining a treaty after the fact, every African agreement becomes provisional, every signature meaningless. Menelik understands that this confrontation is larger than Ethiopia. It is about whether African sovereignty can exist within the European-defined international system, or only at its margins. By the time Italian columns begin advancing from Eritrea, the diplomatic dispute has transformed into something far more dangerous. The words on the page have failed. What remains will be decided by endurance, coordination, and the unforgiving geography of the Ethiopian highlands. The highlands do not reveal themselves all at once. They fold inward, ridge behind ridge, cutting sightlines, breaking formations, and punishing those who move without local knowledge. Paths that look passable from a distance dissolve into rock and ravine up close. Water appears where it is known, not where it is needed. For an army advancing from the coast, every step inland lengthens supply lines and erodes certainty. Across this terrain, Ethiopia mobilizes on a scale few Europeans believe possible. Messengers carry Menelik's call to arms across regions and languages, and the response is immediate. Tens of thousands arrive from Shoa, Tigray, Gojam, Wollo, and beyond. They do not come as a uniform mass, but as a coalition, regional forces led by commanders who know their men and the land intimately. What binds them is not centralized drill, but shared purpose and a clear strategic horizon. European observers often describe these forces as traditional, even archaic. The reality is more complex. Ethiopian soldiers carry a mix of weapons, spears and shields alongside modern rifles acquired through trade with France, Russia, and other powers. Menelik has spent years stockpiling arms, understanding that parity in firepower, even if incomplete, changes the equation entirely. Ammunition reserves, carefully guarded, become as important as manpower. Logistics, not heroics, define Ethiopia's advantage. Empress Taitu oversees supply arrangements with ruthless efficiency. Grain is gathered, routes are secured, and depots are established near likely points of engagement. The army moves with its sustenance, supported by civilian networks that understand seasonal rhythms and local constraints. What appears to Italian intelligence as an unwieldy mass is, in practice, a system designed to endure. Italian preparations tell a different story. General Baratieri commands well-trained troops equipped with modern artillery and rifles, but his army is small relative to the task. Reinforcements are slow to arrive. Supplies must travel from coastal ports, over harsh terrain, through territory that grows more hostile with every mile. Communication with Rome is delayed and distorted by distance, yet political pressure intensifies. Victory is expected, and expected quickly. Baratieri's position becomes increasingly precarious. He understands that time favors Ethiopia. Every day, Menelik's forces remain intact. Italian assumptions weaken. Yet withdrawal carries its own risks: political disgrace, accusations of cowardice, the collapse of Italy's imperial credibility. Caught between military reality and political expectation, Baratieri hesitates, advancing and pausing, probing without committing. Meanwhile, Ethiopian commanders observe patiently. They do not rush to engage. They allow Italian forces to move deeper, stretching themselves thinner. Scouts track movements. Local guides, sometimes coerced, sometimes cooperative, shape Italian understanding of the terrain, not always accurately. The highlands themselves become an active participant, amplifying every miscalculation. European racial ideology continues to cloud Italian assessments. Intelligence reports underestimate Ethiopian coordination, exaggerate internal divisions, and dismiss the possibility of sustained resistance. The idea that an African army could plan, supply, and execute a large-scale operation remains unthinkable to many decision-makers. This is not ignorance of facts, but refusal to interpret them honestly. By early 1896, both sides sense the narrowing of options. Food shortages begin to affect Italian camps. Morale fluctuates. Orders from Rome push for decisive action, framing delay as failure. Baratieri convenes councils of war, weighing retreat against advance, caution against command. Each choice carries consequences beyond the battlefield. In the Ethiopian camp, confidence grows quietly, not because victory is assumed, but because preparation has reduced uncertainty. Menelik understands that battle, once joined, will be costly. He does not seek annihilation, only resolution. The objective is not to chase Italian forces into the sea, but to break the assumption that brought them inland in the first place. On the night before confrontation, movement ripples through the Ethiopian ranks. Fires are banked. units reposition under cover of darkness, guided by commanders who know where dawn will find them. There is no theatrical buildup, no speeches recorded for posterity. The scale of what is about to happen is understood, but not dramatized. This is work, not spectacle. Italian columns, preparing to move before first light, do so under conflicting orders and incomplete maps. Brigades are assigned routes that diverge in the darkness, relying on timing and coordination that the terrain does not forgive. The plan assumes precision from an environment designed to erode it. As night gives way to the pale edge of dawn, the highlands hold their breath. Two armies, shaped by radically different assumptions about power and possibility, are about to meet. The outcome will not hinge on a single charge or heroic stand, but on whether preparation can overcome presumption. Dawn breaks unevenly across the hills near Adwa, light spilling into valleys before it reaches the ridgelines. Italian brigades move separately, boots scraping stone, breath fogging in the cold air. The plan depends on convergence, columns advancing along parallel routes, supporting one another by timing rather than sight. In the darkness and confusion, that convergence begins to fail almost immediately. One brigade drifts too far east. Another slows, unsure of its bearings. Communication falters. Officers consult maps that flatten the land into abstraction, unable to capture the folds and dead ends now rising around them. By the time the sun clears the horizon on March 1, 1896, Italian units are no longer a single force, but several isolated ones, exposed across broken ground. Ethiopian scouts see the separation at once. Messengers move quickly, and decisions follow without delay. Menelik and his commanders do not need to invent opportunity. It has been delivered by misalignment and terrain. Units advance from the heights, not in a single wave, but in coordinated movements shaped by the land itself. The first engagements are sharp and disorienting. Italian troops, trained for set-piece battles, find themselves attacked from multiple directions. Artillery fires, but targets appear and vanish. Rifles answer from distances both closer and farther than expected. The sound carries strangely in the hills, echoing and distorting, making it difficult to judge where pressure is building and where it is breaking. What follows is not a rout in an instant, but an unraveling. Brigades attempt to regroup, only to find routes blocked or already compromised. Orders arrive late or not at all. Ammunition begins to run low. The weight of equipment, an advantage on open ground, becomes a liability on steep slopes and narrow paths. Ethiopian forces press without spectacle. Their movement is purposeful, exploiting gaps rather than seeking dramatic confrontation. Commanders direct pressure where Italian lines thin, then shift before resistance can consolidate. The numerical advantage, long dismissed in European calculations, becomes decisive when paired with coordination and knowledge of terrain. Empress Taitu's role is felt even here, behind the lines. She directs reserves, ensures supplies continue to flow, and refuses calls to pull back prematurely. Her insistence on sustained pressure prevents the battle from resetting into something Italy's forces might stabilize. Momentum, once gained, is not surrendered. By midday, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Italian units are surrounded or retreating in disorder. Attempts at organized withdrawal collapse into fragmentation. Some soldiers fight on stubbornly, others scatter, seeking paths that lead only deeper into hostile ground. Casualties mount, not as spectacle, but as consequence. General Baratieri, miles away from the worst of the fighting, receives reports that arrive incomplete and contradictory. The battle he hoped to avoid has exceeded his control. Decisions made hours earlier cannot be reversed. The assumptions that carried his army inland about speed, superiority, inevitability, are exposed as fatal misjudgments. The fighting ends not with a ceremonial surrender, but with exhaustion and absence. Italian resistance ebbs as units dissolve. Thousands are killed or captured. Weapons and artillery are taken, not as trophies, but as resources. The battlefield quiets gradually, broken only by the movement of the wounded and the calls of those searching for comrades. For Ethiopia, the victory is undeniable, but not triumphant in the European sense. Menelik does not order pursuit beyond what is necessary. The objective has been met. The invading force has been broken. The message has been delivered with clarity no diplomatic note could achieve. News travels quickly, carried by telegraph lines that now transmit disbelief. In Europe, reports are read and reread, numbers questioned, explanations scrambled for. An African army has defeated a European one in open battle, not through ambush or accident, but through preparation and coordination. The framework used to interpret the colonial world begins to crack. On the ground near Adwa, the hills remain unchanged, indifferent to shock and realization unfolding far away. They have done what they always do: amplify the consequences of human assumption. What has ended here is not just a battle, but a certainty that had underwritten an age. Shock moves faster than understanding. In Rome, news of the defeat arrives in fragments, casualty figures that seem implausible, reports that contradict one another, silence where certainty is expected. When the scale of the loss becomes undeniable, the reaction is immediate and destabilizing. Protests erupt. The government collapses. Parliamentary inquiries search for blame, not only in generals and ministers, but in the assumptions that carried Italy into the highlands believing history itself would yield. Italy's imperial ambition does not end at Adwa, but it is permanently scarred by it. The dream of easy colonial legitimacy dissolves, replaced by humiliation and reckoning. For the first time in the age of empire, a European power has been forced to negotiate from a position of defeat with an African state. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed later that year, formally recognizes Ethiopia's sovereignty. The protectorate claim is abandoned. On paper and in practice, Ethiopia stands. Across Europe, the reaction is uneasy. Adwa does not fit the narrative that empire has built to justify itself. Newspapers struggle to explain how a non-European army could win so decisively without undermining the ideology that sustains colonial rule elsewhere. Some accounts minimize the loss. Others frame it as an anomaly, a fluke made possible by terrain or numbers alone. Very few confront the deeper implication that European dominance is not inevitable. Beyond Europe, the impact is electric. In Africa and across the diaspora, Adwa becomes more than a battle. It becomes proof. Proof that sovereignty can be defended. Proof that modernity is not owned by any one civilization. Intellectuals, activists, and future leaders draw inspiration from Ethiopia's survival, seeing in it a refutation of the racial hierarchies used to rationalize domination. Adwa enters political memory as possibility made real. Ethiopia itself emerges changed, but not untouched by cost. The victory preserves independence, yet it also reinforces the pressures of modernization and centralization. Menelik continues to navigate a world that now treats Ethiopia with grudging respect rather than casual dismissal. Diplomacy resumes, this time on firmer footing, but the empire remains surrounded by colonial possessions, its autonomy constantly tested. Empress Taitu's influence endures as well. Her role at Adwa challenges European stereotypes not only about African states, but about leadership itself. She is remembered not as an exception, but as evidence of a political culture more complex than imperial caricatures allowed. What makes Adwa endure is not just the scale of the victory, but its timing. It arrives at the height of European imperial confidence when the world seems already decided. By disrupting that certainty, it exposes empire as a system sustained by belief as much as force. Once that belief fractures, even slightly, the future becomes less predictable. The hills near Adwa do not bear monuments large enough to contain what happened there. Their significance lies elsewhere, in the diplomatic letters rewritten, in the maps quietly corrected, in the generations who carry the knowledge that the colonial order was never as absolute as it claimed. Ethiopia did not win by rejecting the modern world, but by understanding it on its own terms and refusing to be misdefined by it. At Adwa, an empire defended itself not only with arms, but with foresight, coordination, and an unyielding insistence on being recognized as equal. The battle's legacy is not one of domination reversed, but of illusion dispelled. It reminds history that power built on assumption is brittle, and that even in an age of empires, certainty can collapse when it meets preparation and resolve.